I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their life by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Brian Eggert, to the Real Mental podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Well, it's a thrill to have you back because we always have a great conversation. And today we're going to discuss Disclosure Day. And I'm very interested to hear your take on it because I had some thoughts about it. But why don't you start? But first of all, before you start, just give a little quick thumbnail about who you are and what you do for the listeners.
Sure, I've been an independent film critic for about 20 years. I write on deepfocusreview.com. You can also find my reviews on Rotten Tomatoes or Letterboxd at deepfocusreview.com. And yeah, I'll probably have a book of essays coming out next year. I have a series called The Definitives where I write about great films that I particularly love. So I'm kind of compiling some of those into a book and releasing that next year.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
So you're not just a critic, you're a scholar.
Yeah, I mean, technically, yeah, I guess I have a master's in film studies, so I think that's the minimum requirement to take that label. But I do
Yay,
a lot
nerds.
of independent research. Yay, nerds is right. Yeah,
Yay, nerd.
I love reading scholarly texts about film, and I incorporate that a lot into my writing.
Well, there's a lot there, there's a lot there to think about and talk about. So I'm excited to get started on Disclosure Day. So what did you think?
I absolutely adored this movie. I'm a huge Steven Spielberg fan. Not necessarily everything he's ever done, but I think he's got a few weak movies. But I particularly love his sci-fi films. I think he's just one of the best technical filmmakers living. You know, he can create an action scene that is just breathless and elegant and sophisticated in terms of its camera movements and just iconic visuals. And I think, and that's in full display here. I think he's got a number of amazing sequences. I'm kind of an Alien nerd too. I grew up watching X-Files and just reading science fiction. So this movie just kind of had all my pleasure centers tapped, I think. So I also think it's just, and I'm particularly excited to discuss it with you, because I think a lot of people sort of ignore maybe the psychological element of it and how it's sort of all a metaphor for like repressed childhood trauma and repressed memories and that sort of thing. And kind of, the Disclosure Day of revealing that aliens have been here for decades is tantamount to, recalling these suppressed memories. And in fact, it's a plot point that they're recalling these suppressed memories in the film. Yeah, it was just, for me, I had high expectations and it just met them, if not blew them away. It was such a fun theatrical theater going experience, and the acting was outstanding, and just, I loved it. And I know a lot of people are kind of either really passionate about it or they seem to have some major problems with it. And I'm very much in the former camp.
So yeah, I had both. There were parts of it I really thought were wonderful.
Yeah.
And then there were parts of it I had some issues with. So I'll tell you what I thought, and then you can tell me what you think. So
Okay.
a couple of things. First of all, I couldn't understand the motivations of the bad guys. So there's the bad guy number one, who is played by Colin Firth.
Yep.
And then he has a henchman who I don't know, this man was not a famous actor, but he had a very prominent henchman. And you don't really get a sense, especially the Colin Firth character, has he been doing what he's been doing, right? And obviously he wasn't doing it for 70 years, because even though the aliens have been here, he's only a man in his 50s probably, or maybe early 60s, but he's not old enough to have been working in this field for 70 years. So he's come into it. So you don't understand why he's so horrible. Like, he's evil and he's making people do really terrible things using mind control. And I would really have loved to get a little bit of a sense of his motivation, because he just sort of is. And, psychologically, a bad guy who's just a bad guy to me doesn't feel believable. I need a bad guy to have something driving them, a desire, a
Sure.
gripe, something.
I think they did kind of they established that he, along with Jane, sort of believed that the world is not prepared and that the system that we have would crumble if this information was released. And so it's for him it was a matter of going to extreme lengths to preserve the way of life as we know it, because society would break down, markets would crash, and everything would fall apart across the world if this information was released. At least that was my understanding of it, and that I think isn't inherently evil. Like I sort of understand that, I guess, but I think he's going to great lengths, destructive lengths to keep that secret.
Yeah, that doesn't feel like enough to me because I feel like he's still complicit in the torture of aliens. He's still complicit in trying to kill people who are trying to expose his secrets. So there's some very you're saying great lengths, but he has no qualms about engaging in some very antisocial behavior.
Hmm.
And so okay, he might believe that the world is better off, having the secret, but what he's willing to do, the torture, the murder, the disruption of a lot of things in order to keep the secret just feels to me like there's something else going on, and I would love to get just a little peek into his psyche. You know, did he have a trauma that twisted him? You know,
Sure.
in my fantasy as a psychiatrist, I'm thinking he had some kind of trauma that twisted him in a certain way and that, motivated him. But I like to have a sense of somebody's motivation, especially when they're like an evil guy. So that was one of my issues. The other issue for me is that it seemed too easy for our two main characters played by Emily Blunt and Josh help me
O'Connor.
O'Connor, Josh O'Connor. That's right. That it's just seemed too easy for them to arrive at their goals, right?
Hmm.
There was some opposition, but like when Josh his character is creeping around all the bad guys and, finding a car and escaping. It just seems too facile. And, I would think they would have drones, they would have some kind of surveillance. It just, everything was a little too easy for them to achieve their goals without too much opposition. And that felt, again, it's like, hmm, it kind of left me feeling a little detached from the situation because it didn't
Sure.
feel real or possible.
Sure. And I think part of that, again, just to maybe counterpoint, but it reminded me of Minority Report in a way. The precogs in Minority Report who can see everything coming. And so she can completely maneuver, Tom Cruise's character around desperate situations. And there was sort of that they both had in Disclosure Day, they both had this sort of awakening and they've been imbued with these sort of fantastical mental abilities, and sometimes they're aware of them working and sometimes they're not, and they both feel, I think Emily Blunt's character, says she feels like a passenger in her own body, and so that's sort of like propelling her and allowing her to maneuver in these sort of fantastical ways. So I approach that. I've heard this, this argument before that it's maybe too easy for them to escape in certain situations. I saw that as like some sort of extrasensory perception of a situation and them being able to kind of maneuver through the obstacles and get out of it because of that. And we may not understand it the way that, they're seeing it, but I suspended disbelief because of that.
Yeah, well, I buy your explanation. So the problem then is with the filmmaker who didn't give the audience enough of a clue that that was actually happening so that we would be satisfied with the ease with which they
Mm,
got from point A to point B. If that's the case, then they needed to, give us a little more information so we'd be like, "Oh, okay, that's why it's easy for them." As opposed to, "What's going on? Why is it so easy for them?" Because
sure.
I've read critiques about that. So the filmmaker maybe needed to like just underscore that a little bit. But let me tell you the stuff I liked about it, which, the psychological part. I liked how Emily Blunt's character felt so lost.
Mm,
And her character felt so, she was on some level so incredibly adept. Like you say, she had all these powers. And yet, in the middle of having all these incredible powers, she was unbelievably lost and confused, but just going with it. She just knew she had to go with it. She didn't know why, she didn't know what she was doing, but she was just kind of surrendering to the experience, and that felt extremely accurate psychologically. Not that a person would have those kinds of powers, but Everything that happened in her psychologically made perfect sense. Everything that happened with her boyfriend psychologically made perfect sense.
Mhm.
So, and a lot of the things around her, the people interacting with her, the regular people, made really good sense. So that felt really right on. The psychology that way felt very right on, that the individuals, the way that they were reacting within themselves and to one another. Josh O'Connor's character, his psychology, made sense. So I totally bought that. And a lot of times, as you know, because we've talked about it, I look at these characters behaving in a certain way. I go, no, 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 that's not plausible. But these people, all of them, in this extremely crazy, bizarro situation, I could totally buy into their psychological reactions and believe that this is a real experience for real people, even though it's very, out there. So I like that.
Yeah, Spielberg is great at getting at people's emotional reality and in extreme situations, and that's really kind of what I think his sci-fi movies are about. Minority Report is very much about that. AI is about that. Close Encounters. I think that he's more interested in what's going on with those characters than he is connecting all the dots with his premise or whatever. And I think that's what makes his movies so engaging, I guess, on just a purely emotional level, because we can relate to them.
Yeah, I agree with you. Now I want to go back to what you said about this disclosure day and this repressed memories and this buried trauma. So did you just come up with that after you watched the film, or were you reading reviews? Like, how did that idea come to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it was included in my review, and I tend not to read anything before I write. But yeah, the idea of them having to go through this sort of therapeutic process to to remember what happened to them was really, I think, like the the point where I was like, oh, this is really about something. And I think they're taking real life psychological experiences and applying them to a sci-fi movie in a way that I think allows it to be about. You could read this entire movie that way, I think, and consider it as a metaphor for, you know, uncovering these shared childhood traumas that these two characters have. And that is, in some ways, as I was thinking about it afterward, more, I don't know, more of the emotional weight or the substance of this movie than even the alien plot. That's the thing that's driving them. They both have this question inside of them, this untapped need to find something within themselves. And I think that with trauma, you can't articulate it all the time, and you can't, especially if it's like a suppressed memory. My understanding is that it's just on the tip of your brain maybe, and you have kind of flashes of something, and something's there, but it takes therapy to work through that. And maybe it's because, honestly, I've been talking to you over the past like year and doing this podcast with you a few times, where I've been kind of actively thinking about these kind of themes more in films. But that one just, I don't know. I spent a lot of time thinking about this movie because I loved it, and I wanted to know why I loved it, and I wanted to kind of argue for people like there's more here than just a fun alien movie. And I think that he built a lot of that in there with the screenwriter David Koepp. They're very interested in these kind of traumas and these psychological implications of whether it's War of the Worlds or Minority Report or whatever. They're thinking about these ideas when they're telling these stories.
Well, it's super, super interesting that you bring this up because there's like multiple different aspects of trauma in this film. So there's the trauma inflicted upon the aliens, which is horrendous, and they depict that very sensitively, but also very, in a very upsetting way,
Yeah.
very dramatically. There's the trauma that's happening to the world. The world is on the verge of some very bad stuff. And then there's the childhood trauma of the two main characters, which they don't, obviously, they don't know they have it, but they sense that there's something, like you said, there's something there for them to find, but they don't even know where to look.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly on this day, they both start having these weird experiences and off they go. But I feel like this story is not just about the trauma of the main characters. It's really about, how trauma is prevalent in our lives and how we ignore it, we bury it, we're not aware of it, and the impact it has. And we need to we need to face it. Basically, we need to discuss it, disclose it and acknowledge it and address it, whether it's trauma that we're committing to others or trauma that we've been through or, trauma that we're experiencing right now in a global level. Like we need to, you know,
Confront it.
yeah, confront it, bring it up to the surface, put it that way, right? Make it
Yeah.
real.
And I think those conversations are, well, they are difficult and they can, be raw and challenging. And I think that is kind of what this, like you said, what this movie is saying is that, yeah, there may be some global implications and there may be some people who react badly. But I think for the greater good of society, I guess, we have to kind of face that. And I guess in this case, in the metaphor, the traumas that we're not alone in the universe and that, the world / the universe isn't exactly what we thought it was. And that is in itself like just being exposed to a kind of traumatic realization or awakening, I guess. So working through that trauma is traumatic and the trauma itself is traumatic. So it's an interesting way to think about this movie.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I recognized because I was a psychotherapist for many, many years is that facing the trauma, one of the reasons people don't face the trauma is because it's painful. It's painful
Hmm.
to revisit all that stuff, even though it's not actually hurting you. So one of the things I have to say to my patients in psychotherapy is to say, you've already survived the real thing. The memory is not going to hurt you. It's actually going to enable you to heal. But the memory feels, especially because it's a traumatic memory, it feels like it's dangerous and damaging. So I have to really help them to see that the actual memory is not the same as the event that was harmful. And they
Sure.
can face it without it being a destructive thing. That's not always easy for people to grasp, right? They can avoid that memory because they really associate it with something bad happening to them. So in this movie, one of the things I loved about the main characters is that they're running toward awareness.
Hmm.
They're really running toward awareness. They're both on the same plane. They're both wanting to know.
What's kind of interesting about that is that the aliens serve as the therapists. They're the ones who are sort of guiding them through this journey, and they're doing kind of exercises in a way that make it easier for them to remember. They're using, these animal signs that they're familiar with, and they're using, these sort of illusions, I guess, when they're going through the process of remembering. I think it's Emily Blunt's character who remembers this child herself as a child sort of walking toward a cabin.
Mhm.
It's creating these methods of making this therapeutic process easier. And I think that's kind of you're the alien in this situation.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing I really liked is how they didn't know what they were going for. Like they had no idea it was aliens. Like they didn't
Mhm.
know what they were running toward, but they wanted to be aware. And this whole movie, what I was about to say before I let you speak was I feel like this whole movie is about waking up. It's about wake up, guys, like wake up. And earlier, before we started our conversation, we were talking about, in many parts of North America, we're experiencing horrendous smoke and how a lot of people are not even paying attention to it. They're just walking around as though nothing has changed. The government doesn't seem to be really doing anything to prevent it. So we were talking about, kind of like people need to wake up and pressure the powers that be to do something about this before it gets even worse. And,
Yeah.
we're both kind of clearing our throat and coughing because we're really suffering from the smoke. And, how important it is for people to be awake and aware, so very much, it's a very much here and now present reality that we have to wake up. And I think this movie, the main message is wake up. Whatever is keeping you asleep, whether it's your childhood trauma or your
Apathy.
apathy,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's your childhood trauma or your apathy, you have to wake up because things are happening around you and to the people you love, and you need to wake up. And I think I love that message. That was like my favorite part of the film. It's like, wake up.
Yeah, I think that's evident from the kind of the bookends of the movie. It opens, when you think of a Spielberg movie, they usually open very kind of quiet and they slowly build. And you think about any one of his movies, and it's just soft kind of opening that crescendos as it goes. And this one opens with a wrestling match and a wrestler getting his face getting beaten, and you just kind of are like, whoa, this is not what I'm used to in a Spielberg movie. It's like he's slapping you in the face. And then the last scene is, or the last line of dialogue in the film is literally listen. And so I think that, yeah, it absolutely reminded me of Do the Right Thing in a way, where the first line of that movie is like, wake up. And it's Samuel L. Jackson's radio announcer telling people to wake up and pay attention to what's going on around them. And it's the same kind of metaphor, I think.
And how sad that movie was made. The Spike Lee movie was made how many decades ago?
Yeah, yeah. Like
And
89 it was made, so yeah,
yeah,
not much has
yeah,
changed.
more
Yeah,
than
nobody
30
woke up.
years
Yeah,
ago. Yeah, 3.5 decades ago. And, it's a real problem. And I admire Steven Spielberg for being, an old fart and still being very, very, very engaged and wanting to make the world a better place through art.
mm,
And that I will always, revere him for, because that's such a wonderful aspect of art, is to help us to wake up and see things differently. And I feel like he definitely did that. So I'm willing to forgive some of the bits and pieces of the film that, weren't just so for me,
sure.
because of the overriding message, because I think the overriding message is so important. And the other thing I found, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, is how much compassion was in this film. You want
Mm.
to speak to that?
Yeah, I think there's a whole religious discussion with Eve Hewson's character Jane. She's was a novitiate, and at first kind of goes into this conflict thinking, yeah, people can't handle this. So she kind of has this sort of existential journey along the way, and her kind of arc is that she really understands how this is important and we need to kind of like pull ourselves through this and accept that the way that we're thinking about things isn't necessarily the most healthy way of thinking about it, or it isn't acknowledging the truth. So it approaches this problem from multiple angles and really tries to understand and empathize with multiple angles. And yeah, I think for that it's deeply compassionate in understanding different perspectives and realizing that if we're all kind of on the same wavelength, we can kind of get through this together. And I think that's a very hopeful, very Spielbergian way of approaching that.
And I think, if we're talking about metaphors, aliens, right? What's going on in the United States right now is that they're
Mm,
literally killing people for being different,
yeah.
for being quote unquote alien, even if they're not necessarily illegal aliens, they're still aliens. And so they're shooting, it's like, what now, 4 or 5 people have died
Yeah.
because of ICE raids, dubious reasons. And some people weren't even people that they were looking for. But anyway,
Right.
so people are literally dying like within the last few days because of being alien. And I don't think it's too far a stretch to think that Steven Spielberg is saying, we're imprisoning and torturing aliens, for what good, right? What is the purpose? They're not terrible monsters. They're just a little different than you and me. And I think it's also about, tolerance and compassion and inclusion. And, in this day where DEA is like a bad word and they're trying to get rid of it everywhere, I think Steven Spielberg is making, a plea for tolerance and inclusion and diversity, and not vilifying the aliens, but just trying to see them as just a little bit different and maybe even having a lot to offer us. And
Yeah,
certainly in this movie, they did.
absolutely. I think he's very hopeful about the possibility of not only aliens, but just people connecting. And, the villains in his movies are the people who don't want to change and who want to, keep secrets and not connect. And he's very much about connecting. I think that's true from, Jaws onward. It's about kind of confronting the truth and acknowledging the shark in the water, or the, I guess in the case of Post, the Nixon in the White House or whatever. He wants information available and he wants people to connect. I really
Yeah.
love that about his work.
This movie reminds me a little bit about that movie. I think it was Denis Villeneuve, The Arrival.
Yeah.
And again, initially they were thinking the aliens were bad, and they thought that this word that they were trying to translate, they saw as war, but it was really about something much more benign and positive,
Hmm.
and how it took someone who was a good communication specialist to connect and understand that not only were they not bad, but they actually had a lot to offer and a lot of good and a lot of, hope. And again, it's like our misperceptions of those who are slightly different or a lot different, but how, we all lose when we do that kind of thing. And that's, I think, the compassion in that movie and the compassion in Disclosure Day. And that's one of the reasons why I love these sci-fi films. And we're going to be talking about Project Hail Mary, which is also about humans and aliens and,
Hmm.
another take on that theme. And I really love that message, and we can't hear it enough. And if filmmakers have to package it in a fun sci-fi film to get that message through, go for it.
Yeah, I think sci-fi is one of the great genres, and I'm a huge fan of it too. And maybe just genre movies in general, they can take what are very serious issues and package them in a way that doesn't feel like you're being preached to, or doesn't feel like you're getting, a lecture. You can watch a zombie movie and learn about society or something like that, and get a better, more powerful message, I think, than a movie that actively goes out to be about something. You can embed these themes into these movies and have them just under the surface, but not right in your face. And I think that's what's so great about genre movies and sci-fi in particular. They open up the world to us. I think that, like, one of my first major sci-fi experiences was watching Star Trek The Next Generation as a kid, and just seeing kind of the diversity on screen, and being open to science and all that. It showed me the possibility of like a almost utopian world where everybody got along, we didn't need money, and everyone communicated openly, and it still remains an ideal, right, that we haven't achieved yet, but one can hope. And that's what a lot of sci-fi is about, I think.
Yeah, I think it's about giving us perspective and showing us what's possible if we were to, make a little effort, if we were to wake up a
Hmm.
little more, and if we were to try a little harder to move in a direction and not to be apathetic and not to be hopeless and not to just go, oh, whatever. I don't involve myself with politics. It's not important to me,
Right.
which
Yeah.
I always always go like, oh my. Anyway.
Yeah, I have those reactions too, and I hear that occasionally, and I don't try to argue. It's just you just kind of hang your head and be like, oh no. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's lovely to see films like this, talking about such very profound topics, but in a fun ride, like a literally fun ride.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, I don't blame anyone for just watching this movie and being absolutely entertained and then not thinking about it. Like that's kind of the beauty of a lot of Spielberg movies, is that yes, they are very entertaining, and you can watch them, somewhat passively and just be mindless as you're watching it. And I think he gets a lot of criticism for that in some critical circles, but I do think that each of his movies has kind of an underpinning of something deeper that allows you to have these kind of conversations that are about more than just, their popcorn munching escapism.
and I think, he's almost saying without saying that, you have a choice. You can stay on the surface or you can go
Mm.
deeper, whichever you prefer. But, if you go deeper, you get more.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's that's that Colin Firth character, is he wants a controlled surface that he that he can understand, that he can control, and it terrifies him to think of a world that he's not in control of. Yeah. Again, what I love about Spielberg is his just openness to all this stuff.
Yeah, super fun. Well, it's been really fun to talk to you, Brian Eggert, again about another really interesting movie. And I look forward to our next conversation. Like I said, we're going to be talking about Project Hail Mary, which is another sci-fi, quite a different one, but I think
Hmm.
it shares certain themes. And
Yeah,
I'm sure we're going to enjoy that conversation too.
absolutely. Thanks for having me.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental Podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. And while you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 180 episodes and counting. If you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening.